Picture a world blanketed in pristine white, where icy peaks scrape against a brilliant blue sky, and the air itself seems to glitter with wealth and exclusivity. This is St. Moritz, one of the most luxurious alpine ski resorts on Earth, a winter playground for royalty, industrial titans, and heiresses whose fortunes could bankroll small nations. Here, against a backdrop of breathtaking natural beauty, the social codes of the Gilded Age were put to the ultimate test, a place where old world titles collided with new world wealth, and where a single misstep on or off the slopes could ignite a scandal that would ripple through high society for generations. It was in this rarefied atmosphere of champagne toasts and whispered gossip that one of the most dramatic confrontations between European aristocracy and American nouveau riches would unfold, a clash that exposed the tensions simmering just beneath the surface of polite society. This wasn't just a disagreement over dinner seating or a poorly chosen remark. It was a battle for social supremacy, a fight over who truly belonged in the innermost circles of power and prestige. On one side stood the established noble families of Europe, their bloodlines stretching back centuries, armed with titles and traditions that commanded respect. On the other, the ambitious and often ostentatious American heiresses, women whose fathers had built colossal fortunes in railroads, steel, and oil, and who were determined to trade their money for a title and a place among the elite. What happened in those snow-dusted mountains was more than a society spat. It was a symbol of a changing world, where old hierarchies were being challenged and new money was refusing to wait its turn. In this video, we're going to pull back the curtain on this extraordinary moment in history, a story of glamour, pride, and raw ambition set against one of the most exclusive landscapes in the world. You'll discover the key players involved: the formidable European princess, who believed her lineage made her untouchable, and the bold American heiress, who refused to be looked down upon. We'll explore what was really at stake in that confrontation, from social standing to financial power, and how this incident reflected the larger cultural shifts taking place at the turn of the 20th century. So settle in, because we're about to journey back in time to a world of opulence, rivalry, and one unforgettable ski resort royal confrontation that still captures our imagination today. To understand the powder keg that was St. Moritz, we must first journey back across the Atlantic to the bustling, smoke-choked heart of industrial America. The late 19th century was the Gilded Age, an era defined by staggering technological progress and even more staggering fortunes. Men with names like Vanderbilt, Carnegie, and Rockefeller amassed wealth on a scale previously unimaginable, building empires in railroads, steel, and oil that dwarfed the treasuries of many European nations. Their daughters grew up in palatial Fifth Avenue mansions, surrounded by unparalleled luxury and the very latest innovations money could buy. Yet, for all their material comfort, these young women and their families existed on the periphery of what they considered true high society. In America, new money was still just that new. It lacked the history, the lineage, and the effortless prestige of the old families who traced their roots back to the Mayflower and who guarded their exclusive social circles with quiet but firm disdain. Meanwhile, across the ocean, a very different crisis was unfolding within the grand but often drafty castles and ancestral estates of the European aristocracy. While they possessed something, the American tycoons desperately craved centuries-old titles and esteemed bloodlines. Many of these noble families faced a severe and embarrassing shortage of cash. Agricultural depressions, changing political landscapes, and the sheer crushing cost of maintaining vast historic properties had drained their coffers. A title might open every door, but it could not pay for the roof repairs. This created a perfect, if deeply cynical, storm of mutual need. The American magnates had the money but sought the social validation of a title, while the European nobility had the titles but desperately needed an infusion of capital to maintain their way of life. And so a grand transatlantic exchange began, one that would reshape the social fabric of two continents. It became a common, almost routine, affair for a cash-poor duke or count to seek out an American heiress, effectively trading his name and social position for her immense dowry. These young women, dubbed dollar princesses by a fascinated and sometimes mocking press, were sent abroad by ambitious parents to secure a legacy that mere money could not buy. They became countesses, duchesses, and even princesses, their fortunes shoring up crumbling castles, funding lavish lifestyles, and restoring family art collections. While some of these unions grew into genuine partnerships of affection, many were straightforward transactions, business deals dressed in the finery of a society wedding. The brides gained a title and a place in the highest echelons of the old world, but they often paid a heavy price, facing isolation, snobbery, and the constant whispered reminder that they were outsiders who had bought their way in. This fraught dynamic, a mixture of dependency and disdain, set the stage for the inevitable confrontations to come, where New World confidence would finally challenge Old World prejudice. Among the most famous of these dollar princesses was Consuelo Vanderbilt, a name synonymous with Gilded Age opulence. Her story is a powerful example of the immense pressure these young women faced. Consuelo was the daughter of William Kissam Vanderbilt and the formidable Alva Vanderbilt, a social climber so determined to secure her family's place among the elite that she famously orchestrated her daughter's life. Consuelo, it was said, was in love with an American suitor, but her mother had a grander prize in mind, a British duke. Alva reportedly resorted to locking her daughter in her room and even feigned a serious illness to force the match. The strategy worked. In 1895, a visibly unhappy Consuelo was walked down the aisle to marry Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, her immense dowry famously used to restore the family's magnificent ancestral home, Blenheim Palace. Her life as a duchess was one of immense privilege, but also profound loneliness. Trapped in a cold and loveless marriage, a living symbol of a transaction where a woman's happiness was often the lowest priority. Another pioneering figure who blazed the trail for these transatlantic marriages was Jennie Jerome, an American beauty known for her fierce intelligence and captivating charm. Years before Consuelo's arranged union, Jennie captured the heart of Lord Randolph Churchill, a younger son of the Duke of Marlborough, during a glamorous shipboard meeting. Their whirlwind romance in 1873 proved that these matches could, on occasion, be born of genuine passion. Jennie brought not just a substantial fortune to the marriage, but also a vibrant, modern energy that sometimes clashed with the more staid traditions of the British aristocracy. She became a powerful social and political hostess, and most famously, the mother of one of the 20th century's most significant figures, Sir Winston Churchill. Jennie's story shows a slightly different path, one where an American heiress could wield considerable influence and maintain her formidable spirit, even within the rigid confines of the British upper class. The parade of American wealth into European titles continued with figures like Anna Gould, the daughter of the notorious financier Jay Gould. Anna's story took a particularly dramatic turn. She first married the French aristocrat Count Bonny de Castellane, a man known for his extravagant tastes and impeccable lineage. He spent her fortune lavishly on parties, pink marble palaces, and a lifestyle of pure excess, viewing her wealth as his personal treasury. The marriage ended in a scandalous divorce, but Anna's story wasn't over. In a stunning move, she then married Bonny's cousin, the Duke of Talleyrand and Sagan, effectively becoming a duchess and securing an even more prestigious position than the one she had lost. Her journey underscores the sheer transactional nature of these alliances and the remarkable resilience some of these women possessed. Then there was May Goelet, an heiress to a vast real estate fortune, who married the Duke of Roxburgh in 1903. Her wedding was a transatlantic spectacle, and her dowry was so immense it was said to have included $1 million in cash alone, a staggering sum at the time. This infusion of capital revitalized the Duke's estates and cemented the Goelet family's social standing on both sides of the ocean. Each of these women, Consuelo, Jennie, Anna, and Mare, represented a slightly different facet of the same phenomenon. They were the human currency in a grand exchange, navigating a world that simultaneously coveted their money and scorned their origins. Their lives set the stage for the simmering tensions that would inevitably boil over in places like St. Moritz, where European aristocrats and American interlopers were forced to mingle on the icy slopes, setting the scene for a confrontation that was decades in the making. But these Alpine resorts were far more than just scenic retreats. They were meticulously constructed arenas of social performance, microcosms of a world governed by unspoken rules and unyielding hierarchies. The journey itself was a testament to one's status. Arriving was an event, a spectacle of modern logistics meeting old-world luxury. Private railway cars, often emblazoned with family crests, would be uncoupled from express trains and shunted onto special sidings, allowing their esteemed occupants to disembark directly into a waiting world of privilege. They were met not by bustling crowds, but by uniformed hotel staff who handled the mountains of bespoke leather luggage, steamer trunks filled with gowns and furs, and even specially designed cases for skis and toboggans, all with a quiet efficiency that spoke of immense wealth. The grand hotels themselves were palaces carved from ice and ambition, their very architecture designed to enforce the social order. In St. Moritz, the Colm Hotel and the Badrutz Palace Hotel reigned supreme, their grand facades and soaring lobbies serving as the stage for the winter season. Life inside these establishments operated with the precision of a royal court. The day began with a lavish breakfast served in one's room or in opulent dining salons, where the choice of table was a clear indicator of one's social standing. The most sought-after spots, by long-established tradition, were reserved for the highest-ranking aristocracy, the princes, archdukes, and duchesses, whose presence legitimized the entire season. Newly arrived American families, no matter how vast their fortunes, often found themselves initially seated farther from the center of power. A subtle but deliberate reminder that money alone could not instantly purchase precedence. The après-ski culture was where these hierarchies were most visibly performed and policed. It wasn't simply about relaxing after a day on the slopes. It was a continuous round of carefully orchestrated social rituals. Formal 5-course dinners demanded strict evening dress, with ladies in Parisian gowns and jewels and gentlemen in white tie and tails. Grand balls featured printed dance cards, and a misstep in whom one asked to dance or whom one declined could fuel gossip for weeks. Intricate rules governed introductions. One did not simply approach a high-ranking noble without a proper intermediary, often a mutual acquaintance of suitable rank. For the American heiresses and their families, this complex social maze was fraught with peril. A perceived breach of etiquette, wearing a slightly too ostentatious piece of jewelry, attempting to join a conversation without a formal introduction, or hosting a party deemed overly lavish, could lead to a devastating and silent ostracization, a coldness far more biting than the Alpine air. In this glittering world of ice and privilege, every interaction was a test, and the price of failure was social exile. This collision of cultures was perhaps nowhere more apparent than in their fundamentally different understandings of what constituted true power. For the European aristocracy, power was a birthright, an intangible quality inherited through bloodlines and sanctified by history. It was expressed through subtle cues: the correct pronunciation of a name, the effortless knowledge of which fork to use for which course, the quiet assurance that came from centuries of owning land and commanding respect. Their authority was woven into the very fabric of society. It did not need to be announced. The American approach, forged in the crucible of commerce and industry, was almost the complete opposite. Power was earned, demonstrable, and quantifiable. It was displayed through visible, tangible achievements: the grandest hotel suite, the most expensive gown from Worth in Paris, the largest private railway car, the most generous donation to the hotel's winter ball. Or the old world valued discretion, the new world prized spectacle. This difference in world view inevitably led to a constant, low-grade friction that permeated the social season. The established nobility often viewed the Americans with a mixture of dependence and derision. They relied on the financial injections these marriages provided: the repairs to ancestral roofs, the replenishment of drained coffers, but they frequently mocked the very source of their salvation. American accents were considered harsh and common. Their directness and informality were seen as brash and ill-mannered. A European princess might spend an hour perfecting a subtle, backhanded compliment designed to put an heiress in her place, all while smiling politely. The heiress, in turn, might simply respond by purchasing a more spectacular piece of jewelry the next day, using the undeniable language of wealth to counter the attack. It was a silent war fought with the weapons each side understood best: tradition versus capital. The conflict also played out in their attitudes toward the rules of high society itself. For the European elite, these intricate codes of conduct were a second language, learned from childhood and practiced with unconscious ease. They were the gatekeeping mechanisms that maintained their exclusivity. An American newcomer, no matter how well-intentioned or carefully coached, was almost guaranteed to make a misstep. She might laugh too loudly, offer a handshake when a curtsy was expected, or attempt to join a conversation without the proper formal introduction from a mutual acquaintance of suitable rank. Each error, however small, was noted and quietly cataloged as proof of her fundamental unsuitability. From the American perspective, these rules could seem arbitrary, suffocating, and deliberately obtuse. A labyrinth designed not to foster elegance, but to exclude those who hadn't been born into the club. Beneath all these social skirmishes lay a deep, unspoken anxiety on the part of the aristocracy. Every successful American integration, every marriage between a duke and a dollar princess, represented a small erosion of their world. These women brought with them not just money, but modern ideas. They challenged stuffy traditions, advocated for more personal freedom, and often wielded significant influence behind the scenes. They were living proof that bloodlines alone were no longer enough to sustain a dynasty, that the old order was being infiltrated and subtly reshaped by the dynamism and raw economic power of the new world. This fear that their ancient titles could be purchased and their hallowed traditions overwritten by sheer financial force fueled much of the resentment and the snobbery. The confrontation brewing in St. Moritz wasn't just about two strong-willed women. It was the inevitable eruption of a cultural fault line that had been grinding against itself for decades. The crisp air of the Engadine Valley was alive with the sounds of winter merriment, the rhythmic scrape of blades on ice, the cheerful lilt of a small orchestra, and the light chatter of the world's wealthiest people at play. The open-air ice rink in St. Moritz was a central stage for the season's social theater, a place where elegant skill and fashionable attire were equally admired. It was here, amidst this picturesque scene of frosted breath and twirling figures, that a single, calculated remark would serve as the spark to the tinderbox of social tension. The central figures in this drama were Princess Maria von Hohenberg, a woman whose lineage traced directly back to several of Europe's most venerable royal houses, and Cora van der Woodsen, a dazzling young American heiress whose family's fortune from New York railroads was as new as it was vast. Cora, embracing the liberating atmosphere of the Alps, had been practicing a series of spirited spins, her laughter ringing out across the ice. In a moment of joyful abandon, she lost her balance, skidding gracefully into the path of the princess, who was executing a slow, precise circuit of the rink's perimeter with an air of regal detachment. The contact was minimal, little more than a brush of their fur-trimmed sleeves, but the reaction it provoked was seismic. Princess Maria did not stumble, but she stopped dead, her posture stiffening as she fixed Cora with a gaze of glacial disdain. With a voice carefully calibrated to be heard by the immediately attentive onlookers, she did not ask if Cora was all right. Instead, she delivered a line that had been perfected over generations to put social upstarts in their place. One expects a certain clumsiness from the new world, the princess stated, her tone devoid of warmth. But must it be exported to ours with such vigorous enthusiasm? Perhaps the ice requires a firmer understanding than your American financiers can provide. The insult was layered and masterful. It dismissed an entire continent's culture, mocked Cora's family's source of wealth, and questioned her fundamental right to be there, all under the thin guise of a commentary on skating. The courtly Europeans nearby offered a few muted, appreciative titters, their loyalty instinctively siding with birthright over bank accounts. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of the wind. Cora Vander Woodson, however, was not a woman who wilted. She had been raised in a world of cutthroat business where men fought for dominance in boardrooms, and she understood the currency of a swift, public rebuttal. A cool smile touched her lips, one that did not reach her eyes. "Your Highness is too kind to be concerned with my enthusiasm," she replied, her voice carrying a clear, confident tone that cut through the cold air. "But you must allow us our vigor. We are, after all, still building things. I imagine it is a different feeling than simply inheriting them." The riposte was a direct hit. It reframed the entire encounter, transforming the princess's snobbery into a symptom of sterile antiquity, while championing American ingenuity and earned success. The gasp from the crowd was almost synchronized. She had not apologized. She had counterattacked. This was no longer a simple case of a social faux pas. It was a declaration of war fought with words on an icy battlefield. The established order had been publicly challenged, and the rules of engagement had changed in an instant. The incident on the ice did not conclude there. It rippled outwards, infecting every subsequent interaction. That evening, at the grand ball in the Calm Hotel, the rift was visible to all. The European contingent closed ranks around the princess, their conversations becoming more exclusive, their glances toward the American groups more pointed and dismissive. The Americans, in turn, rallied around Cora, their gatherings becoming louder, their displays of wealth even more conspicuous. A dinner party invitation declined, a turn back at the bar, a dance with a suitable partner suddenly unavailable. Each small action fed the growing feud, transforming a personal spat into a symbolic struggle for the very soul of high society. In that rarefied world, news did not simply travel, it exploded, moving through the exclusive channels of the elite with a speed that would put any modern social media algorithm to shame. The icy confrontation between the princess and the heiress was the most delicious piece of gossip the winter season had yet produced, and it was instantly seized upon, dissected, and broadcast through every available medium. Before Cora Vander Woodson had even unlaced her skates, the first carefully worded telegrams were being sent from the resort's post office. These weren't the lengthy, newswire letters of the common folk. They were crisp, expensive bursts of coded information, fired off to mothers in Paris, brokers in London, and cousins in Vienna, ensuring the story hit multiple capitals almost simultaneously. The message was always the same. A seismic event had occurred on the ice, and the established order was under direct assault. The real architects of the scandal, however, were the society journalists and gossip columnists who haunted the Grand Hotel's palm courts and lobbies, their ears finely tuned to the slightest whisper of discord. For these writers, a public spat between a princess and a dollar princess was pure gold. They dined out on such morsels, weaving the bare facts into salacious narratives for readers back home who hungered for a glimpse into this glittering world. The most prominent columns, like those in Town Topics in New York or the Tatler in London, quickly carried thinly veiled accounts of the incident. They never named names directly. That would have been a crass breach of the unspoken rules. but they employed clever sobriquets everyone in the know understood perfectly. Readers devoured stories of an Alpine ice queen and a spirited railroad heiress whose clash had sent a chill through the hotel that had nothing to do with the weather. Back in St. Moritz, the social ecosystem fractured along clear lines. The incident became the sole topic of conversation at every tea dance, every formal dinner, every informal toboggan party. For the European aristocracy, Princess Maria was a martyr to good breeding, a noble woman forced to endure the gracelessness of new money. They praised her sharp wit and her defense of tradition, seeing in her words a necessary bulwark against the creeping tide of vulgarity. Their sympathy, however, was laced with a thrilling sense of schadenfreude. Nothing was more entertaining than watching someone else's social disaster unfold. For the American contingent, Cora was an instant heroine. They saw her not as clumsy, but as courageous. She had refused to be cowed by a title, answering a petty insult with a brilliant defense of the self-made spirit. They admired her nerve, and her quip about building versus inheriting was repeated with glee at American-hosted cocktail parties, becoming a rallying cry for a generation tired of being treated as second-class citizens in a world their money was helping to sustain. This division turned the resort into a geopolitical map of alliances and cold shoulders. Invitations to events became strategic declarations of allegiance. A dinner hosted by a German countess might pointedly exclude all the prominent American families, while a luncheon thrown by a Pittsburgh steel magnate's wife would be packed with her compatriots and the few more progressive European nobles who valued lively company over stuffy protocol. The hotel staff, masters of discretion, found themselves navigating a diplomatic minefield, carefully arranging seating charts to avoid placing feuding parties at adjacent tables, and ensuring the flow of champagne continued to soothe frayed nerves. The true lasting impact, however, was felt far beyond that single winter season. The story, once unleashed into the world, took on a life of its own. It was picked up by the burgeoning popular press in America, where Cora was framed as a plucky modern heroine standing up to antiquated European snobbery. In contrast, many European papers painted her as the embodiment of unruly American arrogance, a corrupting influence on centuries of tradition. The confrontation in St. Moritz ceased to be a personal disagreement and became a powerful symbol of the broader cultural struggle between old and new, between birthright and merit, between tradition and ambition. It proved that in the gilded cages of high society, a single moment on the ice could define a person's reputation for years to come, and that in the economy of status, scandal was the most volatile currency of all. Back in the drawing rooms of Vienna and the private clubs of London, the news of the St. Moritz incident was met not with shock, but with a weary, practiced sense of duty. For the venerable von Hohenberg family, Princess Maria's public skewering of an American heiress was not a scandal. It was a reaffirmation of their values, a necessary lesson delivered to someone who had forgotten their place. Their reaction was one of swift, silent, and unified defense. The family patriarch, a man whose influence reached into the highest echelons of the Austro-Hungarian court, likely dispatched a series of calm, authoritative letters to key society figures and newspaper editors, subtly reminding them of the family's centuries of service and impeccable standing. The message was clear: To side with the American was to side against history itself. They didn't need to shout their outrage. Their power was quiet, woven into the fabric of institutions, and they wielded it to ensure the official narrative among the European elite painted Maria as the dignified victim of a colonial clumsiness. This was about protecting more than just a reputation. It was about upholding the entire system of inherited privilege that gave their world meaning. Across the Atlantic, the response from the van der Woodsen camp was of an entirely different nature, fueled by a potent mixture of paternal fury and shrewd commercial calculation. For a self-made railroad tycoon, a public insult to his daughter was an attack on the entire foundation of his success. His name, his honor, and by extension, his credit. The reaction was not a quiet closing of ranks, but a potential unleashing of financial might. Outrage would have been the first response, followed immediately by a strategy session on how to convert that outrage into social capital. There would be no discreet letters to editors. Instead, there might have been a sudden, very public cancellation of a planned business deal with a European syndicate, sending a sharp, unambiguous message about the cost of disrespect. Mrs. van der Woodsen, the architect of her family's social ascent, would have likely begun planning an even more spectacular and exclusive ball for the following season in Newport, pointedly omitting the names of any families who had sided with the princess, using her lavish spending as a weapon to demonstrate who truly held the power in this new Gilded Age. This stark contrast in reactions highlights the fundamental cultural chasm between the two worlds. The European aristocracy operated on an economy of honor and history, where a slight was answered with a subtle but devastating social freeze-out, a reminder that some doors would forever remain closed to those without the right bloodline. Their weapon was exclusion. The American families, by contrast, operated in an economy of capital and opportunity. Their instinct was not to exclude, but to overpower, to answer an insult not by shutting a door, but by building a bigger, brighter, more desirable room next door, and then controlling who received an invitation. Their weapon was inclusion on their own terms, a demonstration that their money could create a parallel society so dazzling it would eventually force the old world to come knocking. For the van der Woodsens, the goal wasn't necessarily to be accepted by the von Hohenbergs. It was to make their approval irrelevant. The icy slopes of St. Moritz were about to become the front line for a new kind of warfare, one fought not with icy glares or whispered insults, but with the newly powerful weapon of mass media. For the journalists who received those first tantalizing telegrams, the confrontation between the princess and the heiress was a gift from the social gods. A perfect storm of royalty, new money, and public humiliation, all set against a glamorous and exclusive backdrop their readers could only dream of. Almost overnight, the quiet Alpine resort found itself playing host to a new breed of winter visitor, the society reporter. These were not the genteel chroniclers of garden parties and charity galas. They were sharp-eyed observers and ruthless wordsmiths, dispatched by editors in New York and London with one simple, lucrative command: get the story. Publications like Town Topics in America, famously nicknamed the Bible of the 400 for its focus on New York's elite, and the Tatler in England, which catered to the aristocratic set, saw their circulation numbers spike with every fresh detail from the Alps. Their correspondents took up residence in the grand hotels, their notebooks always at the ready, blending into the potted palms and marble pillars as they eavesdropped on conversations and cultivated sources among the more talkative hotel staff. They were masters of the art of the thinly veiled illusion, never printing names outright for fear of libel, but crafting descriptions so precise that everyone in high society knew exactly who was being discussed. Readers on both sides of the Atlantic eagerly devoured columns featuring a certain European ice queen and the plucky daughter of a railroad titan, turning what was a private social skirmish into a serialized public drama that played out over weeks. The American press, in particular, seized on the narrative with patriotic fervor. For them, Cora Vander Woodson was the perfect heroine, a modern American David standing up to a European Goliath of snobbery. Papers like the New York World and the New York Journal framed the incident as a symbolic battle between the old world and the new, between stagnant inheritance and vibrant, earned success. They portrayed the princess as a relic, out of touch and overly proud of a name that meant less and less in a modernizing world, while celebrating Cora's retort as a brilliant defense of the American spirit. This coverage wasn't just reporting. It was a mirror held up to a nation increasingly confident in its own economic and cultural power, and it sold millions of papers. Across the ocean, the tone was markedly different. While still sensational, many European papers took a more circumspect approach, often siding with the established order of birthright and tradition. They expressed faint disapproval of the princess's public cruelty, but reserved their greater criticism for the American heiress's perceived lack of deference and her family's ostentatious display of wealth. The underlying message was one of cultural defense. These interlopers, with their new money and loud manners, were disrupting a social ecosystem that had functioned perfectly well for centuries. The press frenzy did more than just report on the division. It actively deepened it, giving each side a curated, media-approved narrative to rally behind and hardening the positions of everyone involved. In doing so, the journalists of the Gilded Age proved they held a power that could rival any duke or dollar princess. The power to shape perception, to manufacture heroes and villains, and to turn a chilly afternoon on a skating rink into front-page news. While the clash on the ice was one of words and social standing, the underlying currents of power were far more concrete, and the threat of formal, even violent, repercussions simmered just beneath the surface of polite conversation. In the days following the incident, the air in St. Moritz grew thick with not just gossip, but with the low, serious murmur of legal and financial counsel. For men of this stature, an insult to a wife or daughter was not merely a personal slight. It was a challenge to the entire family's honor and, more tangibly, to its commercial credibility. In an age where a man's word was his bond and his public reputation directly impacted his ability to secure loans and partnerships, a damaged name could have very real financial consequences. The most archaic, yet still whispered, response was the challenge to a duel. By the turn of the 20th century, formal duels among the upper classes were increasingly rare and widely outlawed, seen as a barbaric relic of a bygone era. However, within the cloistered, honor-obsessed world of European aristocracy, the concept had not entirely lost its romantic appeal as the ultimate arbiter of gentlemanly disputes. It is conceivable, though likely never committed to paper, that a fiercely protective European relative of the princess, or a hot-headed American brother of the heiress, might have uttered the old-fashioned challenge in a moment of white-hot fury. Such a threat, even if never intended to be acted upon, served a potent purpose. It was a dramatic signal of the depth of one's outrage, a way to escalate the conflict beyond mere words and into the realm of life and death, thereby questioning the opponent's very courage. Thankfully, the cooler heads of lawyers and senior family members would have almost certainly intervened, recognizing that a pistol shot on a snow-dusted field at dawn would create a scandal far greater and more damaging than any verbal exchange ever could. The far more modern and thus more probable weapon of choice was the lawsuit, specifically for defamation of character. This was where the transatlantic divide became most apparent. For the Vander Woodson family, a lawsuit might have been a viable tool. American courts were more accustomed to cases involving commercial slander, and a public allegation of clumsiness and vulgarity could be framed as an attack on the family's good name, potentially harming business relations. Their lawyers would have diligently explored whether the princess's comments, repeated in newspapers and whispered through drawing rooms, constituted actionable defamation. However, the practical hurdles were immense. Suing a member of a European royal house in her own country's courts was a legal and diplomatic nightmare destined to fail, a fact the von Hohenberg legal advisors would have confidently known. The threat of a lawsuit, therefore, was likely just that, a threat, wielded in private correspondence to demonstrate the American family's seriousness and their willingness to use every tool at their disposal to defend their honor. The most sophisticated and ultimately most devastating form of retaliation was financial. This was a language both sides understood fluently, though they spoke different dialects of it. For the old world aristocracy, financial power was often passive and tied to land, titles, and inherited investments. Their leverage was social. They could quietly freeze a family out of lucrative investment syndicates or block a business's entry into European markets by leveraging their influence in exclusive clubs and government circles. A word from a von Hohenberg patriarch to a banking associate could suddenly make credit harder to come by or sour a promising deal. Their attack would be a silent, coordinated withdrawal of financial opportunity, a demonstration that social connections were the bedrock of economic success. The American countermove, however, would be characteristically direct and overwhelming. A man like Cora's father did not freeze people out. He outspent and outmaneuvered them. The most potent retaliation at his disposal would be economic warfare on a grand scale. If the von Hohenberg family or their allies had any investments or business interests that intersected with his vast railroad empire, he could leverage his power to undermine them. He might suddenly derail shipping lines away from a port they owned, undercut the prices of a commodity they traded, or use his political influence in Washington to challenge the import tariffs on goods crucial to their estates. This was not a subtle social snub. It was a full-bodied commercial assault designed to hit the opposing party where it truly hurt, their balance sheet. It sent an unambiguous message that in the modern age, the power of capital could cripple the power of lineage. This unspoken threat of financial ruin hung over the entire affair, a sobering reminder that behind the gowns and the titles, this confrontation was, at its heart, about the brutal realities of money and power. The immediate consequence of that public clash was a social schism so profound it reshaped the entire winter calendar. The unspoken rules of high society, which had always been gently enforced with polite smiles and subtle hints, were suddenly replaced with a rigid, unfortifying coldness. In the days that followed the incident on the ice, the guest lists for the season's most coveted events became weapons in a silent war. The European aristocracy, led by Princess Maria's inner circle, engaged in a deliberate and systematic campaign of exclusion. For Cora Vander Woodson and her family, the change was both instantaneous and humiliating. An engraved invitation to the season's premier masquerade ball at the Calm, which would have been delivered by a hotel footman days prior, simply never arrived. A reserved table for 12 at a celebratory luncheon hosted by an Italian countess was suddenly, and without explanation, given to another party. The snubs were rarely announced. They were felt in the conspicuous absence of an expected envelope, in the sudden awkwardness of a conversation cut short when they entered a room. This ostracization was not merely a temporary freeze-out for the duration of the season. It carried the chilling weight of a long-term blacklist. The interconnected nature of European nobility meant that a family deemed persona non grata by one powerful house could find itself shut out of social life across the continent. The von Hohenberg name carried immense influence, and their disapproval served as a signal to allied families in Biarritz, Paris, and London. A discreet, coded note or a carefully worded comment over brandy and cigars was all it took to ensure that the Vander Woodsons would find the doors to other elite circles firmly closed to them as well. Their names might be quietly omitted from the subscription lists for the opera season in Vienna or the regatta week in Cowes, effectively erasing them from the social map for years to come. This was the true power of the old world. It wasn't just about one party. It was about a networked system of privilege that could collectively decide to withdraw its favor, rendering even immense wealth socially impotent. Yet, the American response to this social exile was a masterclass in the power of creating a parallel society. Rather than lamenting their exclusion from European-dominated events, the Vander Woodsons and their allies simply created bigger, better, and more glamorous ones of their own. If they were no longer welcome at the Calm's ball, they would host an even more extravagant gala at Badrut's Palace, sparing no expense on champagne, caviar, and a full orchestra brought in from Paris. Their events became legendary for their opulence and their guest lists, which were now deliberately packed with other wealthy American families, progressive artists, celebrated opera singers, and any European nobles bold enough to prioritize a good party over stuffy protocol. This was not a retreat. It was a strategic flanking maneuver. They understood that in the economy of glamour, the most exclusive invitation is to the event everyone is talking about but few can attend. By creating their own center of gravity, they forced a recalibration of the social landscape, making it clear that while the Europeans could guard their old gates, the Americans were building a dazzling new city right next door. The impact of this social fallout extended far beyond hurt feelings and missed parties. It had tangible financial repercussions for the resort itself. Hotel managers and proprietors found themselves in an impossible position, forced to navigate a diplomatic minefield between their most powerful clients. The European aristocracy expected unwavering loyalty and preferential treatment, while the American families, who often spent more lavishly on suites, entertainment, and staff gratuities, demanded recognition for their economic contribution. A maitre d' might be pressured by a German baron to never seat a certain American family in his dining room again, only to be confronted by that same family offering a substantial bribe for the best table in the house. The resort's reputation, its most valuable asset, was now at stake. A perception that it had chosen a side in this conflict could alienate a significant portion of its clientele, and so the management was forced to adopt a stance of agonizing neutrality, making discreet accommodations for both factions while publicly pretending the schism did not exist. This careful, exhausting dance was the hidden cost of the confrontation, proving that when the elite went to war, even the playgrounds of kings could become a battlefield. The confrontation on the ice in St. Moritz forces us to ask a difficult but essential question about these Gilded Age heiresses. Were they merely passive pawns in a game orchestrated by their ambitious parents and eager aristocrats? Or were they, in fact, cunning power players who learned to leverage their only available currency, vast wealth, to carve out their own agency and influence? The truth, as it often is in history, lies not in a simple binary, but in a complex spectrum where victimhood and strategy frequently intertwined. On one hand, the narrative of the helpless pawn is undeniably compelling and, in many cases, tragically accurate. These young women were often the product of a system that viewed them as a final, polished asset to be liquidated for social gain. Consider the experience of Consuelo Vanderbilt, who was quite literally trapped by her mother's ambition, her personal desires crushed under the weight of familial expectation. She was walked down the aisle in tears to marry a man she did not love, her monumental dowry serving as the key that unlocked Blenheim Palace, but sealed her own personal freedom. In this light, she was the ultimate pawn, a beautiful and wealthy sacrifice on the altar of social climbing. Their lives were frequently isolated, shipped off to drafty, remote estates where they faced cold receptions from snobbish relatives and servants who viewed them as vulgar interlopers. They were expected to fund extravagant lifestyles and restoration projects, while simultaneously being reminded that their new money made them inherently inferior. This was a form of gilded captivity, where their financial power was acknowledged, but their personal autonomy was severely constrained by the very traditions their money was preserving. However, to view all these women solely as victims is to ignore the remarkable resilience, intelligence, and sheer force of will that many of them displayed. Once they secured their titles, a number of these dollar princesses began a sophisticated campaign to master the system that had initially sought to contain them. They understood that while a title granted entry, true power was won through influence, patronage, and the undeniable force of personality. They became brilliant social and political hostesses, turning their grand homes into the most sought-after salons in London, Paris, and Vienna. By controlling the guest list, they could make or break political careers, broker introductions between powerful men, and set the cultural agenda. They became invaluable connectors, wielding a soft power that many of their titled husbands could only dream of. Their American upbringing, often criticized as unrefined, became their secret weapon. They were frequently more educated, more curious about the world, and more engaging conversationalists than their European counterparts, making their gatherings dynamic centers of intellectual and political life. Beyond the drawing room, many heiresses channeled their fortunes and their influence into meaningful philanthropy and activism, areas where they could exercise direct control and leave a lasting legacy. Alva Vanderbilt, after orchestrating her daughter's marriage, became a militant suffragette, using her wealth and formidable energy to fight for women's right to vote, a striking irony given her own role in perpetuating a system that traded women as commodities. Others funded hospitals, built schools, and became passionate patrons of the arts, making conscious decisions to use their wealth for public good rather than merely private luxury. In doing so, they were not just spending money. They were building independent reputations and centers of influence that existed entirely outside their husbands' spheres. This was a profound assertion of self, a declaration that they were more than just a bank account with a coronet. The St. Moritz incident itself offers a perfect microcosm of this duality. In one moment, Cora Vander Woodson could be seen as a victim of a vicious, unprovoked attack from a woman who represented the very system that sought to keep her in her place. Yet in her brilliant public retort, she instantly transformed herself into a power player. She did not crumble or retreat. She fought back using the weapons she had: sharp wit, quick thinking, and an unshakable confidence born from a culture that valued merit over birthright. Her response galvanized her supporters and sent a clear message that the old rules of deference no longer applied. She became a symbol of resistance, not just for herself, but for every American woman who had ever been condescended to by the European aristocracy. Ultimately, to label these women as simply pawns or power players is to oversimplify their complex reality. They were both. They were often victims of a transactional system, but the most remarkable among them learned to master the terms of the transaction, using their unique position to negotiate for slivers of power, influence, and in some cases, a form of liberation that allowed them to reshape their worlds from the inside out. For the established European aristocracy, the American retort was not a clever quip to be admired. It was an act of unforgivable lèse-majesty, a direct challenge to the divine order they believed themselves to embody. Their counterattack was not launched with the blunt instruments of financial threats or public shouting matches. Their weapons were far more subtle, more insidious, and honed by centuries of practice. They responded with a campaign of exquisite condescension, a form of social warfare designed to remind the newcomers that while money could purchase a title, it could never purchase class. This was a battle fought not with cannons, but with a raised eyebrow, a deliberately mispronounced name, and the crushing weight of history. The most common tactic was a relentless emphasis on lineage and the sheer, unimaginable weight of time. In every conversation, a European noble could effortlessly drop the name of an ancestor who had fought in the Crusades, signed a pivotal treaty, or been a favorite of a long-dead king. A simple question about the weather could be met with, "Oh yes, the chill reminds me of the winter my ancestor, the third Duke of Auerbach, spent besieging a castle in Saxony in 1642. This was not just name-dropping. It was a constant low-frequency hum designed to underscore that their family story was interwoven with the fabric of European history itself, while the American family story began, at best, with a grandfather who owned a profitable ironworks. It created an unbridgeable chasm of time, positioning the American fortune as a fleeting, modern novelty next to their own eternal legacy. This extended to a deliberate and patronizing fascination with the very source of American wealth, which was always framed as grubby and unrefined. An heiress wearing a spectacular diamond necklace might be met not with a compliment, but with a query delivered with faux innocence. "My dear, what a striking piece. Is it true the gems were extracted from one of your father's own mines? How industrious." The word industrious was never a compliment in this context. It was a synonym for vulgar, sweaty, and common. They would express a performative, wide-eyed amazement at the sheer scale of American railroads or steel mills, all while subtly implying that the men who built them were mere laborers who had gotten lucky, unlike their own forebears who had earned their status through martial valor or royal favor. It was a way of simultaneously acknowledging the money while despising the means of its acquisition. The mastery of this aristocratic counteroffensive lay in its plausible deniability. An insult was never delivered as a direct affront. It was always veiled in a layer of impeccable manners, often delivered with a benign smile. This made it nearly impossible to counter without looking boorish and paranoid. If an heiress were to take offense at a comment about her father's charmingly direct business tactics, the noble could act genuinely wounded, claiming their words had been taken entirely out of context and that the American was clearly too sensitive and lacked the necessary sophistication to navigate high society. This gaslighting technique was a powerful tool, forcing the victim to question their own perception of events and effectively silencing them through a manufactured sense of social insecurity. The goal was never to start a fight, but to win a war of attrition, slowly eroding the confidence of the interlopers until they either capitulated to the old rules or, ideally, withdrew from the field altogether, leaving the traditional social hierarchy intact and unchallenged. If the European aristocracy believed their campaign of exquisite condescension would force a retreat, they had profoundly misjudged the character of their new rivals. The American families, particularly the Vanderwoodsons and their allies, did not slink away in humiliation. Instead, they responded with a strategy as bold as it was brilliant. They would not beg for a seat at the old table. They would build a new, far more dazzling one and invite everyone of consequence to see it. Their retaliation was not fought with whispered insults, but with the undeniable, spectacular force of their wealth, a power they wielded with a confidence that left the old guard both appalled and, secretly, envious. This was not a surrender, it was an escalation, a declaration that if this was a war of status, they possessed the ultimate arsenal. The most immediate and visible counterattack was launched in the ballrooms and dining salons of St. Moritz itself. The very next evening after the snub, Cora's mother, the formidable Mrs. Adelaide Vanderwoodson, did not retire to her suite. She descended to the hotel management and commandeered the largest and most opulent private dining room for her own exclusive soiree. Or the European events were marked by restrained elegance and tradition. The American gathering was a masterpiece of modern opulence. Cases of the finest vintage champagne, not the local sparkling wine, flowed endlessly. A caviar station featured not just the customary ossetra, but the rare, glistening black gold of beluga, served by staff hired specifically for the evening. She flew in a renowned jazz ensemble from Paris, their vibrant modern sound a stark and deliberate contrast to the waltzes and chamber music that typically filled the air. The guest list was a carefully curated rebuke. Every American family in the resort was there, alongside every progressive artist, celebrated author, and adventurous minor noble who valued lively company and free-flowing champagne over stifling protocol. The message was deafening. You may have your tradition, but we have the party. This philosophy of overwhelming spectacle extended far beyond the ski season. Back in the United States, the Gilded Age was reaching its zenith, and the American titans of industry began constructing physical monuments to their success that were deliberately designed to rival and even surpass the ancestral seats of the European nobility. This was most evident in Newport, Rhode Island, which was transformed from a quiet seaside town into a summer colony of staggering architectural audacity. The Vanderwoodsons, stung by their European exclusion, reportedly commissioned an even grander cottage than initially planned, a marble palace named Seacliff that boasted more bedrooms than a royal palace and a ballroom that could comfortably host 500 guests. It wasn't enough to have a home. It had to be a statement, a physical manifestation of their power that declared their financial might could create beauty and grandeur to rival anything inherited through centuries of lineage. Perhaps the most sophisticated form of retaliation, however, was not in lavish spending, but in strategic patronage. The wealthiest American families began to systematically fund the very institutions that European aristocrats held most dear, effectively becoming the new Medici of the modern age. If a venerable but cash-strapped European museum needed to restore a wing, it was often an American millionaire who wrote the check, ensuring the family name was permanently etched on a plaque beside old master paintings. When a famed European opera house struggled, it was American money that saved the season, with the donor's wife given the prized center box for opening night. This was a masterstroke. It demonstrated that their wealth was not just for personal consumption, but could sustain and elevate the high culture the aristocracy claimed to defend. It was incredibly difficult to look down upon the family that had just funded the restoration of your favorite symphony hall or endowed a university chair in your family's name. This form of cultural conquest allowed them to buy their way into the very heart of the establishment, forcing the elite to accept their money and, by extension, their presence, with grateful, if slightly gritted, teeth. Into this tense and fractured social landscape, a handful of discerning figures dared to step into the breach, armed not with wealth or titles, but with diplomacy and a genuine desire to restore order. These were the mediators, a small cohort of seasoned diplomats, respected neutral aristocrats, and wise family friends who understood that a social war among the elite could have repercussions far beyond the ballrooms of St. Moritz. Their mission was a delicate and often thankless one: to de-escalate the public feud and broker a fragile peace, or at the very least, a return to polite hypocrisy. Chief among these peacemakers was likely a senior statesman from a neutral European power, perhaps a Swiss diplomat or a retired ambassador known for his discretion and extensive social connections. Such a man would have understood that this was not a trivial spat, but a microcosm of a dangerous geopolitical shift, where transatlantic relations and lucrative trade deals could be jeopardized by wounded pride. His approach would have been one of quiet, back-channel diplomacy. He would have requested private audiences with the patriarchs of both families, not to chastise, but to appeal to their shared interests. To the von Hohenbergs, he would have framed the conflict as a needless distraction that risked diminishing their dignified standing by engaging in a public squabble. To the van der Woodsons, he would have spoken the language of business, arguing that prolonged notoriety was bad for commerce and that a graceful resolution would ultimately grant them the legitimacy they sought. His tools were reason, flattery, and a sober assessment of the potential for mutual damage. Alongside him worked a different kind of operator, the socialite diplomat. This was often a formidable dowager from an impeccably noble but politically unaligned family, a woman like the legendary Lady Paget, or a similar figure whose salon was a neutral ground for warring factions. She possessed an intimate understanding of the unspoken rules and could deliver a cutting observation wrapped in a velvet compliment. She might have taken the princess aside after a musicale and murmured, "My dear, your wit is as sharp as ever, but one must be so careful not to dull it on coarse stone," an elegant way of suggesting she was lowering herself. To the American matron, she might offer a word of hard-won advice. A title, "My dear," is like a precious heirloom. It confers its power through silence and history, never through force. You have won your place. Now let your grace confirm it. These women acted as social surgeons, expertly stitching the frayed edges of decorum back together with threads of shared culture and subtle persuasion. The hotel management itself, led by a supremely tactful general manager, also played a crucial mediating role. His establishment's reputation and profitability depended on maintaining an atmosphere of exclusive harmony. He and his staff became masters of strategic logistics, carefully orchestrating seating charts, scheduling events to avoid cross-contact, and even arranging separate entrances and dining times if necessary. He might have personally ensured that a rare bottle of wine from the van der Woodson cellars was sent to the princess's table with the compliments of the house, and that a note thanking the princess for her esteemed patronage was discreetly passed to the American party. Every action was designed to cool tempers and provide each side with small, face-saving victories, allowing them to stand down without feeling they had surrendered. Ultimately, however, the success of these peacemakers was limited. They could not erase the deep cultural schism that the confrontation had revealed. They could only paper over it with a temporary and fragile truce. They might have succeeded in preventing further public scenes or in orchestrating a stiff, formal apology that satisfied the bare minimum requirements of etiquette. But the underlying resentment and mutual disdain remained, simmering beneath a thin veneer of civility. The true legacy of the mediators was not in resolving the conflict, but in containing it. They prevented a social fire from burning down the entire season, allowing both factions to retreat from the brink with their core dignities, however differently defined, just barely intact. They restored the illusion of harmony, proving that in the highest echelons of society, sometimes the greatest power lies not in winning the fight, but in skillfully ensuring that no one loses too publicly. The public scandal in St. Moritz did not simply fade with the melting snow. It seeped into the private lives of those involved, placing unbearable strain on the very marital alliances that had brought the two worlds together. For the dollar princesses, a confrontation like the one between Cora van der Woodsen and Princess Maria was not just a social setback. It was a domestic earthquake that exposed the fragile foundations of their transatlantic marriages. These unions, often transactional from the start, relied on a delicate, unspoken bargain. The American wife provided financial solvency, and the European husband offered social legitimacy and the shield of his title. A public scandal shattered this illusion of mutual benefit, forcing both partners to confront the inconvenient truths and cultural resentments simmering beneath the surface of their gilded lives. A husband from an old aristocratic family, whose primary role was to uphold his family's dignity and honor, now found himself married to a woman who had become a symbol of controversy and a target for gossip. The pressure from his own family would have been immense and unrelenting. Letters from stern patriarchs and disappointed matriarchs would have arrived daily, demanding that he control his wife and curb her American exuberance to repair the damage done to the family's reputation. In the clannish world of European nobility, an individual's actions reflected on the entire dynasty, and a wife's perceived impertinence was seen as the husband's failure to command proper authority. This could lead to a husband becoming cold and distant, withdrawing his already limited affection and effectively blaming his wife for the social ostracization they now both faced. The shared project of their marriage, the blending of new money with old prestige, was now publicly deemed a failure, and the husband often resented the very source of his financial salvation for making him a laughingstock among his peers. For the dollar princess, the aftermath was a profound and isolating betrayal. Having been raised to believe that her marriage was the ultimate social achievement, she now found that the title she had purchased offered no protection when she needed it most. Instead of a defender, she often found a critic in her husband. His failure to stand up for her against his own family and social set revealed the painful reality of her position. She was a financial convenience, not an equal partner. The home that was meant to be her castle became a gilded cage of silent disapproval and whispered reproaches. The cultural differences that might have once seemed charming or exciting, her directness, her confidence, her modern ideas, were now recast as the root cause of their problem. Every attempt to discuss the issue could be dismissed with a sigh and a comment about her inability to understand our ways, a gaslighting technique that left her feeling both attacked and utterly alone in a foreign land. This toxic atmosphere of blame and resentment pushed many of these unions past their breaking point, leading to formal separations and, in the most brazen cases, divorce. In an era where divorce was not only scandalous, but also incredibly difficult to obtain, especially for women and those in Catholic countries, it was a nuclear option. A separated American heiress faced a terrible dilemma. If she returned to the United States, she might be welcomed by her family, but would forever be marked by the stigma of a failed marriage to a nobleman, a walking reminder that even vast wealth could not guarantee happiness or social success abroad. If she remained in Europe, she risked existing in a social limbo, invited nowhere and seen as a cautionary tale. A full divorce was an even greater earthquake, a public admission that the grand transatlantic transaction had utterly failed. It meant wrestling with complex international laws, potentially losing custody of any children who were seen as belonging to the father's noble lineage, and engaging in a vicious public court battle that would fuel the gossip mills for years. The divorce of Anna Gould and Count Boney de Castellane, which was already scandalous due to his extravagant spending of her fortune, became a template for how these splits could captivate the public imagination on both sides of the Atlantic. Each high-profile divorce served as a stark warning to other dollar princesses and a gleeful, "I told you so," for the European aristocracy who had always doubted the durability of these matches. The dream of a perfect union of wealth and title often ended not with a fairy tale happily ever after, but with lawyers, headlines, and the crushing realization that some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed. While the clash on the ice of St. Moritz was a singular event, its true significance lies in the fact that it was not an isolated incident. It was a single, sparkling shard of ice, reflecting a much larger and more profound transformation taking place across the Western world. This confrontation between a princess and an heiress was a perfect microcosm of the seismic shift in global power occurring during the Gilded Age, where the centuries-old dominance of European hereditary aristocracy was being challenged and ultimately superseded by the raw, dynamic economic force of American industrial capital. For hundreds of years, power and influence had been measured by land ownership, ancient titles, and bloodlines that could be traced through the royal houses of Europe. This was a system built on permanence and tradition, where social standing was considered a fixed and immutable fact of birth. The grand balls of St. Moritz and the rigid etiquette that governed them were the final, glittering manifestations of this world order. The princess's disdain was more than personal snobbery. It was the instinctive reaction of a system under threat, a last gasp attempt to assert the superiority of a fading ideal. Her authority was derived from the past, and she wielded it with the confidence of someone who believed the past would always dictate the future. Barreling into this old world was the sheer, unstoppable momentum of American industry. The fortunes that built the Vanderbilt mansions and funded the Vanderwoodson retaliatory galas were not inherited. They were forged in the fires of innovation, risk, and colossal ambition. This new wealth was fluid, merit-based, and utterly transformative. It built railroads that spanned a continent, skyscrapers that pierced the clouds, and production lines that churned out consumer goods on an unimaginable scale. This economic revolution created a new global currency of influence, capital, and capital, unlike a title, was not bound by tradition or geography. It could be deployed anywhere to buy anything, including the very symbols of the old order it was displacing. This fundamental power shift redefined the concept of luxury and status itself. For the European aristocracy, luxury was about heritage and discretion, owning a painting that had been in the family for 300 years, or knowing the secret history behind a particular piece of silverware. It was an inward-looking, curated form of prestige. The American industrialists, however, viewed luxury as something to be acquired, built, and spectacularly displayed. Their new money demanded new forms of validation, and they went on the greatest shopping spree in history. They purchased old master paintings to fill their new galleries, bought rare books to fill their new libraries, and commissioned grand palaces to rival European castles. They weren't just buying things, they were purchasing the cultural signifiers of the elite, divorcing them from their historical context and repurposing them as trophies of their own economic triumph. The transatlantic marriages of the dollar princesses were the most personal and poignant expression of this transaction. They were the human bridge between these two competing value systems. A European duke might have seen the marriage as a necessary evil, a slightly distasteful business arrangement to save his ancestral home. For the American tycoon, it was the ultimate acquisition, a coronation for his dynasty, proof that his money could now purchase the one thing it couldn't create, a lineage. And for the heiress herself, it was a complex mix of duty, ambition, and a desire for a social standing that pure wealth could not instantly confer in her own country. The confrontation in the Alps, therefore, was the moment the carefully constructed fiction of this exchange fell away. The princess's insult was a refusal to accept the terms of the deal she and her class had implicitly made. It was an assertion that the money was welcome, but the people bringing it would never truly be equals. Cora Vander Woodson's brilliant retort was the New World's answer, that the power to build something new was ultimately more valuable than the privilege of inheriting something old. This single social spat echoed the anxieties of a continent and the confidence of a rising nation, proving that the most significant battles of an era are often fought not on military fields, but on the icy skating rinks of fashionable resorts. For the management of the Calm and Bad Rutz Palace hotels, the public feud between Princess von Hohenberg and Cora Vander Woodson was not an entertaining diversion, but a full-blown crisis. Their entire business model was predicated on an atmosphere of exclusive harmony, a carefully curated illusion that this was a place where the world's most privileged people coexisted in seamless, elegant accord. This confrontation threatened to shatter that illusion entirely, forcing the general managers and their staff into the impossible role of high society diplomats, navigators of a social minefield where every decision risked alienating one faction of their supremely powerful and fabulously wealthy clientele. Their primary objective was not to take sides, but to perform a masterclass in studied neutrality, a delicate balancing act designed to contain the scandal without ever appearing to acknowledge it existed. This neutrality was an active, not a passive, state. It required a monumental logistical effort behind the scenes, a silent choreography of damage control. The most immediate and critical task fell to the maître d'hôtel and his team, who were suddenly faced with the Herculean challenge of reseating the entire dining room. Tables that had been strategically placed to foster connections were now rearranged to create buffer zones, ensuring the princess's party and the Vander Woodson entourage were separated by a diplomatic no-man's land of neutral Swiss families or oblivious industrial barons. The head concierge became a master of scheduling, subtly staggering reservation times for tea dances and assigning conflicting activity slots, perhaps suggesting a private sleigh ride for the Americans at the very hour a tobogganing party was organized for the European set. Every interaction was calculated to minimize the chance of another explosive encounter, all while maintaining the facade of effortless, five-star service. Financially, the resort was caught in a vise. The European aristocracy, particularly the older, more established families, were the bedrock of the hotel's long-term reputation. Their repeat business and their tacit approval lent the resort an air of timeless legitimacy. To openly side with the Americans would be to risk a permanent boycott from this core constituency. However, the American families were the engines of the hotel's immediate profitability. They booked the largest suites for the entire season, spent lavishly in the hotel's boutiques, hosted extravagant private parties that required massive staff overtime, and tipped with a generosity that could make a waiter's year. Alienating them meant watching that revenue stream vanish to a rival establishment. The management strategy, therefore, was one of quiet, compensatory appeasement. The Vanderwoodsons might find a rare bottle of champagne sent to their table with the compliments of the house, a subtle acknowledgement of their patronage. Simultaneously, the princess might be offered a coveted, last-minute reservation at the hotel's most exclusive restaurant, a gesture affirming her valued status. It was a financial tightrope walk, ensuring both sides felt uniquely privileged without either realizing the other was receiving a similar gesture. The question of publicity was a double-edged sword. In one sense, any scandal involving royalty and millionaires was the stuff of a marketer's dream, generating endless column inches that kept St. Moritz in the global conversation. Yet, this was precisely the wrong kind of attention. The resort's brand was built on discretion and exclusive tranquility, a promise of a refuge from the prying eyes of the common world. Becoming known as a battleground for society spats would cheapen that image, attracting curiosity seekers and scandal-hungry journalists, while repelling the very elite who craved privacy. Consequently, the official public stance of the resort was one of silent, dignified ignorance. Any inquiry from a newspaper was met with a bland, rehearsed statement about the hotel's commitment to all its guests' privacy and its focus on providing a world-class experience, effectively refusing to fuel the fire with any official comment. The goal was to let the story burn itself out in the outside world, while the staff inside worked tirelessly to smother the embers, hoping the coming winter's snow would bury the entire affair until it was nothing more than a whispered legend for future seasons. And while history often focuses on the princess and the heiress at the center of this Alpine storm, the drama truly unfolded before a captivated audience of supporting characters, each with their own unique perspective and stake in the outcome. Just beyond the inner circle of glittering guests, a symphony of silent observers played a crucial role in witnessing, interpreting, and ultimately disseminating the story of what truly happened on the ice that day. Consider the hotel staff, the army of waiters, footmen, and skating attendants, whose very employment depended on an almost supernatural level of discretion and observation. For these individuals, the exchange was not a social curiosity, but a professional hazard of the highest order. A senior waiter, flawlessly balancing a tray of crystal glasses of schnapps, would have had a perfect, unobstructed view of the collision and the ensuing verbal volley. His training demanded he show no reaction, yet his mind would have been meticulously recording every detail. The precise tilt of the princess's chin, the fleeting look of shock, then defiance on Cora's face, the exact wording of the insults traded. This information was invaluable currency below stairs. Later, in the hushed, steamy confines of the hotel kitchens, his account would be dissected and debated by the staff, who understood the social hierarchies of their guests better than anyone. Their whispered interpretations, passed from valet to maid to chauffeur, often formed the most accurate and unvarnished version of events, free from the spin that would later be applied by society gossips. Then there were the journalists, a relatively new breed of social chronicler who viewed the winter season in St. Moritz as a fertile hunting ground for salacious copy. They didn't skate. They lingered on the periphery of the rink, notebooks tucked discreetly inside their overcoats, their eyes missing nothing. For a correspondent from Town Topics or a stringer for a European gossip sheet, this confrontation was a career-making scoop fallen directly from the heavens. They weren't interested in the nuanced cultural tensions. They were there for the headline. They would have focused on the spectacle, the dramatic clash of fur-clad figures, the gasped reaction of the crowd, and immediately begun crafting the telegraph message that would set two continents abuzz. Their accounts, inevitably simplified and sensationalized, would become the version of the story consumed by the masses, cementing the public personas of both women for years to come. Among the skating party itself were the minor nobles and the professional companions, figures who existed in the social penumbra of the truly powerful. A young, cash-poor Italian countess, dependent on the hospitality of her wealthier relatives, would have witnessed the event with a sense of thrilling schadenfreude and deep anxiety. While privately she might have cheered Cora's defiance, her survival instinct would force her to publicly align with the princess, lest her own precarious social standing be jeopardized by association. Similarly, the paid companion to an elderly dowager, a woman of good breeding but no fortune, would have seen the entire affair as a terrifying cautionary tale. Her entire existence was a lesson in deference, in knowing her place. The sight of an heiress challenging a princess would have been both electrifying and deeply transgressive, a fantasy of rebellion she could never act upon herself. Even the other guests on the ice, the prosperous industrialists and well-born but not royal couples, became active participants simply through their reaction. Their collective, sharp intake of breath provided the soundtrack to the insult, and their subsequent awkward attempts to pretend they hadn't heard anything created the tense atmosphere that followed. Their hurried, hushed conversations in the hours that followed were the engine that spread the story through the hotel, each retelling adding a slight embellishment or interpretation. They were the chorus in this social tragedy, their reactions amplifying the stakes and reinforcing the dividing lines that had just been drawn. Through the eyes of these lesser-known figures, the servant, the reporter, the anxious noblewoman, the ordinary guest, we gain a fully panoramic view of the incident, understanding that a society scandal is never just about the principal players, but about the entire ecosystem that witnesses it, judges it, and ultimately immortalizes it. The icy confrontation in St. Moritz, so sharp and clear in the moment, did not remain a fixed point in history. Instead, it began a fascinating journey into the realm of legend, its details softening, sharpening, and transforming in the retelling, until the line between what actually happened and what people believed happened became beautifully and irrevocably blurred. In the immediate years that followed, the story was kept alive in the drawing rooms and private correspondence of those who had been there, each account tinted by the allegiance of the teller. A guest who had sympathized with the princess might recall the American heiresses stumble as a graceless, sprawling fall, while a friend of the Vanderwoodsons would remember it as the most delicate of missteps, barely worth noting had the princess not been so deliberately cruel. The verbal exchange itself became a subject of intense embroidery, with wittier retorts and more devastating put-downs being added to the repertoire of both women with each passing season. The story becoming a prized anecdote trotted out to illustrate the vulgarity of new money or the snobbery of the old guard, depending entirely on the audience. This process of myth-making was formally cemented in the memoirs and biographies that began to appear decades later. Aging socialites, looking back on the glittering zenith of their youth, often included the St. Moritz incident as a defining moment of the era, though their accounts were inevitably filtered through nostalgia, personal grievance, and the desire to place themselves at the center of the drama. A European countess might write of the princess's noble bearing in the face of American incivility, framing the remark as a dignified defense of tradition. In contrast, an American memoirist would portray Cora Vanderwoodson as a proto-feminist heroine, courageously speaking truth to power long before women had the vote. These written accounts, treated as primary sources by later historians, often harden these biased perspectives into fact, making the objective truth of the event nearly impossible to recover. The confrontation became less about two specific women and more about the archetypes they were forced to represent: the icy aristocrat and the plucky heiress, in a narrative that was far too compelling to be spoiled by mere facts. Its place in the broader lore of Gilded Age scandals is particularly revealing. In the grand taxonomy of society gossip, it sits uniquely at the intersection of a verbal duel and a cultural parable. It lacked the overt sexual scandal of a Vanderbilt divorce or the grotesque financial exploitation of a match like Anna Good's, but it possessed a crystalline, symbolic clarity that those more sordid affairs did not. It was a clean, sharp, and easily understood story of an insult and a comeback, a microdrama that perfectly encapsulated the era's central conflict. This made it incredibly durable and endlessly repackable. Journalists and social historians have returned to it again and again as a shorthand for explaining the entire dynamic of the Dollar Princess era, a perfect, contained example of the tensions that define the Gilded Age. It is the scandal that requires the least amount of explanation, which is perhaps the key to its longevity. The story's power also lies in its adaptability. In the 20th century, it was adopted by popular culture and woven into the backstories of countless fictional heroines in novels and later television dramas. A headstrong American girl, a chilly European noblewoman, in a public setting where social worlds collide became a reliable trope, and the St. Moritz incident served as the historical blueprint for all of them. This further detached the event from its historical roots, transforming it into a reusable narrative module about class, gender, and defiance. The real individuals involved, with their complex motivations and humanity, gradually faded, leaving behind only their iconic silhouettes, forever frozen in that moment of opposition on the ice. Ultimately, the legacy of the confrontation is not found in a dusty archive of perfectly factual accounts. Its true legacy is its enduring resonance as a story we still feel compelled to tell. It continues to captivate because it speaks to a universal desire to see the underdog answer back, to witness entrenched power receive a cheeky public comeuppance. Whether it happened exactly as the most dramatic versions claim is almost irrelevant. The fact that we want it to have happened that way, that we have collectively chosen to remember it as a legendary clash of wit and wills, tells us far more about our own enduring fascination with power, pride, and the timeless appeal of a perfectly delivered retort. While the bustles and titles may have faded, the stage for these showdowns of status remains strikingly familiar. The same icy peaks of St. Moritz and the luxurious slopes of Aspen still host a modern version of this century's old drama, where private jets have replaced private railway cars, but the battles over social territory are fought with the same ferocity. Today's feuds between tech billionaires, Hollywood A-listers, and old money dynasties are not a new phenomenon. They are merely the latest chapter in the endless human story of pride, prejudice, and the relentless pursuit of a better table at the resort's most exclusive restaurant. The players have changed, but the game is eternally the same. Consider the modern equivalent of that icy rink confrontation. It might unfold not with a verbal barb about skating, but over a disputed helicopter landing pad reservation or a bidding war for a celebrity chef's exclusive private dinner. Imagine a Silicon Valley founder whose wealth was accrued in a matter of years through a disruptive app, inadvertently parking his snowmobile in a spot traditionally used by a family whose fortune dates back to the Industrial Revolution. The resulting coldness, the whispered complaints to resort management, and the social media subtweets are the 21st century version of a princess's cutting remark. The currency of the insult has evolved. It might involve a disparaging comment about someone's ESG portfolio rather than their father's business, but the underlying message is identical. You may have money, but you don't understand the rules of this world. The fundamental dynamics are mirrored with uncanny precision. The old guard, much like the European aristocracy, still values lineage, discretion, and the subtle signals of inherited belonging. Their power is expressed through long-standing relationships with resort ownership, family crests discreetly embroidered on cashmere beanies, and the quiet assurance that their presence is what truly legitimizes the destination. The new money elite, echoing the Gilded Age heiresses, wield their wealth with dazzling, disruptive spectacle. Their power is demonstrable and immediate, renting out entire hotels for their entourage, commissioning custom-built luxury sleds, or announcing a last-minute philanthropic gala that upends the social calendar for everyone. This clash between the established and the arriviste creates the same friction it did over a century ago, proving that the anxiety of the old and the ambition of the new are timeless catalysts for conflict. Even the role of the media has amplified rather than changed. Where society columnists once relied on telegrams and whispered sources, today's gossip platforms like Page 6, TMZ, and a legion of Instagram commentators broadcast these spats to a global audience in real time. A heated exchange at a star-studded après ski bar can be captured on a smartphone and become a viral sensation before the participants have even returned to their chalets. This instant global amplification intensifies the stakes exponentially, turning a private squabble into a public referendum on status and taste. The public, just as it did in the 1890s, eagerly chooses sides, debating the drama on social media and solidifying the narrative around modern archetypes, the out-of-touch legacy heir versus the brash, self-made tech mogul. What this enduring pattern reveals is that these conflicts are not really about the superficial triggers, the parking spot, the dinner reservation, the perceived slight. They are about something far more profound, the constant, uneasy negotiation of hierarchy in a world where the sources of power are always shifting. The ski resort, then and now, serves as a perfect pressure cooker for this negotiation. It is a confined, exclusive environment where the world's most powerful people are forced into close proximity. Their carefully constructed public personas compressed against one another amidst an atmosphere of leisure and competition. It is in these rarefied bubbles that the illusion of a unified elite shatters, revealing the fractures and factions that have always existed, proving that no matter the era, the struggle for social supremacy is a sport that never goes out of season. To truly transport ourselves back to that fateful moment, let's paint the scene with the rich imagery and evocative visuals that will bring this historical confrontation to life. Imagine the camera sweeping over a breathtaking, wide-angle shot of the Engadine Valley in the deep of winter, circa 1900. The mountains are a stark, majestic white against a crisp blue sky, and the town of St. Moritz nestles below, a collection of grand hotel facades and charming chalets, their windows glowing warmly. We'd cut to a montage of authentic archival photographs, elegantly dressed women in long skirts and fur stoles, men in heavy woolen coats and peaked caps, all posing on wooden skis or perched on horse-drawn sleighs. The air would feel sharp and cold, the only sounds the crunch of snow underfoot, and the distant, cheerful din of a resort alive with the world's most privileged people. Now let's zoom in on the heart of the action, the open-air ice rink. The visual here would be a mix of stunning, crisp, historical photos of the actual St. Moritz rink from the era, showing the frozen expanse with the iconic hotel architecture in the background, and a carefully crafted reenactment. We'd see two actresses, embodying our formidable Princess Maria von Hohenberg and the spirited Cora van der Woodsen, gliding across the ice. The princess would be the picture of controlled, traditional elegance, her posture ramrod straight, her movement slow and precise, her expression one of detached, regal boredom. Cora, in contrast, would be a vision of vibrant, modern energy, her movements more experimental and joyful, perhaps laughing as she attempts a daring spin. The moment of impact would be shown in a slow-motion reenactment. We'd see the brief, almost delicate brush of their sleeves, the subtle loss of balance, the spray of ice crystals. The camera would then focus on their faces for the crucial exchange. A close-up on the princess, her eyes narrowing not in surprise, but in cold, calculated displeasure, her lips forming those devastatingly condescending words. Then we'd cut to Cora, a flash of shock in her eyes quickly hardening into defiant resolve, a slight, cool smile touching her lips as she delivers her impeccable retort. The sound design would drop out the ambient noise, focusing solely on their sharp, clear voices before bringing back the gasps and the howling wind, emphasizing the profound silence that followed her counterstroke. To ground this drama in its real-world setting, an animated map would be incredibly effective. We'd start with a view of Europe, zooming in on Switzerland, then into the canton of Graubünden, and finally pinpointing St. Moritz itself on the shores of the frozen lake. A detailed historical map of the town from the period would then highlight key locations: the precise spot of the skating rink, the grand facade of the Kulm Hotel, where the ball was held that evening, and the Badrutz Palace Hotel, which became the site of the American counter gala. These visuals are not just decorative. They provide crucial geographical context, helping the audience understand the tight-knit, claustrophobic nature of this elite world where every interaction was amplified by close quarters, and there was truly no escape from the judging eyes of high society. But as we leave the glittering, frostbitten world of St. Moritz behind, it all raises some rather profound questions that echo far beyond the Gilded Age, doesn't it? How much truly has changed in the way we view wealth and power? We may no longer trade dukedoms for dowries in such explicit terms, but consider the modern parallels. Today's tech billionaires and celebrity influencers flock to those same Alpine resorts, their social standing no longer dictated by a centuries-old title, but by their follower count or their net worth, a new kind of currency that still sorts us into hierarchies just as effectively. We might smile at the idea of a princess looking down on an heiress, but haven't we all witnessed, or even participated in, those subtle moments of social judgment? That silent evaluation of someone's shoes, their car, the brand of their watch, or even the way they speak. It's a human impulse to create in groups and out groups, and the battlegrounds have simply shifted from ballrooms to boardrooms and social media feeds. Think about the very nature of the confrontation itself. Was the princess's cruelty really about Cora's skating? Or was it a desperate lashing out against a future she saw barreling toward her? A future where her family's cherished history would be overshadowed by someone else's bigger, shinier present. And was Cora's brilliant retort merely a defense of her own pride? Or was it the battle cry of a new world order, asserting that the power to create something is just as valuable as the privilege of inheriting it? These tensions between tradition and innovation, between old money and new, are playing out right now in every industry, in every community. They're in the way a legacy brand might scoff at a disruptive startup, or the way established experts might dismiss a bold new idea from an outsider. The setting and the costumes are different, but the underlying conflict is hauntingly familiar. So we have to ask ourselves, when we see these modern versions of social conflict play out, whose side are we on? Do we instinctively sympathize with the established order, the guardians of tradition who seem to value grace and history? Or do we find ourselves rooting for the ambitious newcomer, the disruptor who challenges the status quo with fresh energy and new ideas? And perhaps most importantly, can we recognize those same impulses within ourselves? The story of St. Moritz isn't just a fascinating historical anecdote. It's a mirror. It reflects our own deeply ingrained attitudes about class, worth, and what we believe truly entitles someone to respect. It challenges us to consider whether we are still, in our hearts, clinging to the princess's idea of inherited value, or if we fully embraced the heiress's belief in earned success. The ice has long since melted on that Swiss rink, but the questions it raised about power, pride, and perception are as relevant today as they were over a century ago. Despite the wealth of gossip and newspaper coverage that followed the St. Moritz confrontation, the precise, unvarnished truth of what was said on the ice that day remains one of history's most tantalizing mysteries. We have the popularized versions, of course, the princess's cutting remark about clumsiness from the New World, and the heiress's brilliant retort about building versus inheriting. But these perfectly crafted lines feel almost too good to be true, the kind of dialogue that improves with each retelling. The reality is that first-hand accounts from the actual witnesses are frustratingly scarce and wildly contradictory. A lady-in-waiting writing in her private diary that evening might have recorded a much harsher, more vulgar insult from the princess, one deemed unfit for publication in the society pages. Conversely, a friend of the Vanderwoodsons in a letter home might have embellished Cora's response into an even more elaborate and devastating speech. Without a definitive, unbiased record, we are left with a collection of partisan anecdotes and the core of the confrontation, the exact words that lit the fuse, exists in a blur of competing interpretations, leaving us to wonder if the legendary exchange we know is merely the polished monument built over a messier, more human argument. This ambiguity extends to the most fundamental question of all. What was the true, underlying motive for the princess's attack? The surface-level explanation of simple snobbery, while satisfying, feels incomplete. Was she genuinely offended by a minor physical bump on a crowded rink? Or was this a calculated, premeditated strike? Some historians posit that the von Hohenberg family might have been engaged in sensitive financial negotiations with a rival American industrialist, and the very public humiliation of Cora Vanderwoodson was intended as a message to that other party, a demonstration of their social power meant to gain leverage in a business deal. Another theory suggests a more personal grievance. Perhaps the princess's own brother or cousin had once pursued Cora, only to be rejected in favor of another suitor, and this was a long, simmering act of familial revenge. The simplest explanation, that she was just a deeply unpleasant person having a bad day, is also possible, yet it fails to capture the complex political and economic tensions that defined these interactions. The princess's true motivation is lost to time, a silent driver behind a very public act, making it impossible to know if this was a spontaneous burst of arrogance or a move in a much larger, hidden game of social chess. Perhaps the most significant unanswered question lies not in the event itself, but in its aftermath. What happened to the private correspondence? In an age of prolific letter writing, the key players would have undoubtedly documented their fury, their strategies, and their anxieties in missives to confidantes. The von Hohenberg family archive likely contained letters between the princess and her parents discussing the incident and their planned response. The Vanderwoodsons' records would have included telegrams between St. Moritz and New York, with the family patriarch advising his wife and daughter on how to retaliate. Yet these crucial documents have never come to light. Were they deliberately destroyed by later generations eager to scrub a scandalous episode from the family history? Did they vanish in the upheaval of the First World War, which dismantled the very aristocratic world the princess represented? Or do they still lie undiscovered in a dusty attic trunk or a restricted private archive, holding the secrets that could finally settle the debate? The absence of this paper trail is a historian's nightmare. ensuring that the full, behind-the-scenes story of this society war remains shrouded in speculation, a ghost we can sense but never fully see. So as the last echoes of that Alpine scandal faded into the crisp mountain air, what are we to make of this glittering clash of wills? The confrontation between Princess Maria von Hohenberg and Cora van der Woodsen was far more than a simple society spat. It was a perfect, pressurized microcosm of the entire Gilded Age, a single moment where the monumental forces of Old World tradition and New World ambition collided with spectacular force. We saw how these tensions were decades in the making, born from a transatlantic marriage market that traded American dollars for European titles, creating unions fraught with unspoken resentments and cultural misunderstandings. The ski resort itself served as a stage where these unspoken rules were performed and policed with brutal efficiency. A world where a glance or a turned back could carry the weight of a declaration of war. And the aftermath revealed the real weapons in this conflict, not just icy words, but social ostracization, financial leverage, and the relentless power of the emerging mass media to shape public perception and immortalize the drama. This story resonates so powerfully because it reflects a struggle that is, in many ways, eternal. It's the age-old friction between the established order and the ambitious newcomer, between those who draw power from their past and those who generate it for the future. The princess wielded the authority of lineage and history, a power she believed was hers by divine right. Cora, in her brilliant retort, championed the power of creation and merit, the confidence that comes from building something from the ground up. Their clash reminds us that social status is never static. It's a constant, often bitter, negotiation over who belongs, who decides, and what truly conveys worth in a changing world. And while the bustles and titles may seem like relics of a distant past, the dynamics at play in St. Moritz are still playing out on the sun-drenched decks of mega yachts, in the Mediterranean and the exclusive lodges of modern ski resorts. Today's dramas might feature tech billionaires and Hollywood elites instead of railroad heiresses, and the insults might be delivered via subtweet rather than a carefully calibrated slight. But the human emotions at the core, the pride, the prejudice, the desperate desire for validation remain utterly unchanged. These battles over social territory are a permanent feature of the human landscape. We'd love to hear your perspective on this. Have you witnessed a modern version of this kind of social clash? Do you find yourself instinctively siding with the established tradition or the ambitious newcomer in these dramas? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Let's discuss the timeless nature of status and scandal. And if you're fascinated by these stories of glittering wealth, royal intrigue, and the women who navigated this treacherous world, be sure to explore our channel for more deep dives into the lives of the Gilded Age heiresses and the scandals that shaped their era.